Okay, we are live. Hello, Helena. How do you pronounce your name? How do you pronounce your name? I always pronounce. I guess my instinct is to pronounce it like the capital of Montana.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Just Helena.
Okay, yeah, that's how the capital of Montana is pronounced. I think. Anyway, who cares? So, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good.
This might be the
Woke up.
earliest stream I've ever done. By the way, 8:50
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't have
a.m.
any
Central
better
Time.
times.
No, this is fine, and I mean, it's productive and all American to get going
Yes,
in the a.m.
yes, absolutely.
Um, Actually, no, it's not. That's bogus. So, could you just? So, I guess the impetus for this conversation is because as this protest movement has arisen over the past month, you've seen trans issues also come to the forefront in concert with the Black Lives Matter issues and the general anti-racism issues. And on the surface, those things don't seem to the naked eye to have much to do with one another. And yet there's a very strong focus on trans issues within the left-wing activist world, but even within sort of the mainstream corporate world. I mean, McDonald's yesterday was putting out Black Trans Lives Matter advocacy tweets.
Yeah.
And yeah, so what is your take on that dynamic as of late?
I am honestly not really surprised by it. I think a lot of people don't really understand what's going on because they don't really understand the history of how these ideologies formed. And I think most people are they're really used to the classic kind of civil rights era view on racial issues, and then kind of the classic feminist, like 1960s, 1970s version of feminism, and all these different movements started out separately. But I think later on, there was a new form of ideology about all these different issues, obviously intersectionality, that kind of combined all of them into this singular conglomerate, where all of these different identities were put into a hierarchy. And so I think that's why the trans stuff is being lumped into the Black Lives Matter stuff, because this is kind of a new era of this civil rights activism, even though I don't think it's actually civil rights. I think it's just an ideology that is based on labeling certain groups as oppressive and certain groups as victims, instead of actually looking to solve problems in society, if that makes sense.
Yeah, intersectionality is, if people aren't familiar, is an idea or a concept popularized initially by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a critical race theorist at, I believe, Columbia University, and maybe an additional university. And in sum, it's that you have these interlocking oppressions, and that if you are a woman, that's a state of oppression which intersects with being Black or being gender non-binary or being any other number of identity statuses. And that, like, you can't understand one without reference to the other. They all are intersectional. And I remember when Hillary Clinton in 2016 in the Democratic primaries tweeted out a chart. It was supposed to explain intersectionality, and it was just like this massive, convoluted flow chart type thing that, like, obviously the average person is not going to understand unless they're well versed or immersed in the literature around this issue. And sure enough, as tends to happen, these things get increasingly mainstreamed. And Hillary Clinton adopting it was already an indicator that it was mainstream, but now it's like fully mainstream, and it explains, I think you're right, to a large degree, why now trans activism is so prominent just within the activism world writ large, or at least the left-leaning activism world. Anyway, could you just give a little bit of your personal background? Because I don't remember how I found it exactly, but somebody sent me some kind of website on the trans education curriculum in the UK. Which for whatever reason, the UK seems like a step ahead of the US in terms of how far they've gone down this trajectory for whatever reason. I'm curious why that would be the case. I don't know exactly. Especially because like the UK has been run by a conservative government for the past 10 years. Interesting. But that led me to the website that you're affiliated with, or the group. And just like explain in a nutshell version how you came to be associated with that group, what it is, etc.
Yeah, so you're talking about Peak Resilience Project. That is a project that I and three other detransition women started like 2 years ago. Basically, just one of our mutual friends kind of said, "Hey, I know these other women. Why don't you guys get together and make some YouTube videos?" So we ended up doing that. But the way that I ended up there obviously was through detransitioning. Long story short, when I was about 15, when I was 14, I joined the website Tumblr, and that kind of opened the door into these like kind of social justice intersectional ideologies. And before I get into the next part, I just want to say that
you're sorry to interrupt, but you're how old now? 21, is that right?
Yeah, 21. I turned 22 next month.
Okay, so that means you were born in 1998.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just so people get I mean, it's good to get a sense of like the generational nature of some of this. So to have like a
I think
works.
Yeah, and I also think that generational nature is relevant.
So I was born in 1988. Okay, and like a lot of this stuff, was still on the periphery for me. Like it wasn't quite as mainstream when I was that age, right? So like it's an interesting generational marker. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, what I was going to say is the reason I said that the trans lives matter being kind of really strongly associated with Black Lives Matter is not surprising to me, is because I joined Tumblr at a young age, around 14, and that was kind of the first time I was ever exposed to the idea of civil rights outside of just learning about it in history class. And it was immediately presented to me in this very intersectional way. And so that was kind of what I thought was normal. I thought it was a very normal worldview. And I thought that everyone had that worldview. And I thought that this is what you believed if you were progressive. So that's why now watching what's happening right now, it just kind of feels like that old community that I was in on Tumblr, like walking out of the computer and just going into real life. And I think a lot of those people kind of have the same perception that I did, that this is very normal. This is what it is to be progressive. This is how civil rights has always been. And even within the trans community, there's this idea that Black trans women, created gay rights, and Black trans women were on the forefront of the civil rights issue in the 1960s. It's just cisgender society doesn't want you to know about it. They do genuinely have that belief. So I think that's kind of what's going on there. It's just this perception of what it means to be progressive and what it means to be on the left that is severely warped by online communities that have been influenced by the academic ideology and academic theories. Just to explain that a little bit further. But so yes, at 14, I joined Tumblr. I first got very into the social justice aspect of all of this without identifying as trans. I just kind of saw the world in like these hierarchies, and I saw trans people as being some of the most oppressed because they don't get visibility. There's this epidemic of trans murder, which is not real. And so I began to seek out to be a good ally.
Let me just stop you very briefly. When you say the epidemic of trans murder is not real, it's not to deny that people who are trans sometimes get murdered. The question is whether that rises to the status of epidemic, which is how it often gets framed to justify the marshaling of societal resources around this alleged need to prevent an epidemic of trans murder. Like I had Katie Herzog on a little while ago, and we discussed this a tad, but she's documented that very comprehensively. Anyway, continue, please.
Yeah, very good way of putting it. Yeah, so in order to be a good ally, which was what was demanded of someone who at the time was a straight cisgender girl, I started seeking out more and more trans people on Tumblr to follow. And as I started following more young females who are identifying as trans, I started really what they were saying started really resonating with me. They talked about how much they hated their bodies. They talked about this, they hate their breasts, so they wear hoodies even in hot weather. And like that was something that I did. And it felt at the time that I had just not realized that what I was going through was gender dysphoria. And so I kind of self-diagnosed myself with gender dysphoria, and I began identifying as trans. At first I was non-binary, and then within a year I was just identifying as trans, and I wanted, all the transition and surgery and all that kind of stuff.
So when you begin to identify as trans, so you would have been 14, 15, 16, somewhere
15.
in that time? 15,
15,
okay.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
That doesn't, when you begin to identify as trans, I mean, you can identify as such without necessarily taking any of the tangible steps to modify your physicality, right? So you can still adopt that identity in a kind of precursor stage to maybe seeking out the surgery or hormones or any of the more kind of tangible things to sort of change your biological makeup.
Mm-hmm. Correct. But I think for me, and I think for a lot of other young girls, the identity of being a trans man is a way to conceptualize a lot of emotional pain in a way that kind of makes sense, and it seems very straightforward. Whereas without that identity and without that clear-cut pathway of like, here's what you need to do to feel better, you're just going to be stuck in this kind of pool of hectic emotions that you don't really know what to do with, and you feel very hopeless because you're so young, you don't have any perspective, and you don't have any life experience. So I think a lot of them, despite the fact that you can identify as trans without taking all of that upon yourself, I think a lot of young girls identify as trans because you can take those steps, because they seem like a way out.
I mean, and also we should note that girls in particular, teenage girls going through adolescence, going through puberty, where their body changes, right? I mean, and this is not exclusive to girls, but tends to be pronounced among girls somewhat. I mean, I'm sure you could find many cases of boys going through the same thing, right? But girls having this experience at that age is like a universal human fact, right? Throughout history. Yeah. There's nothing new about people who were born in like 1998 going through that, right? But what is new is that you have this social media infrastructure that is imbued with an ideology that is rather new, right? Yes. So it gives you sort of a mode of expression for that discontent that is a very common, if not universal, experience for girls. And so it's just it's a new outlet for what is a standard thing. Yeah.
And I think part of what makes this so popular amongst young girls right now is the social aspect of it. So like, I don't think I would have identified as trans if I had just read about it on like in some article. That wasn't how that came to be for me. I very much saw what other girls were doing and how they were conceptualizing what they were going through. And through both like observing that and getting the impression that that is how I should conceptualize my pain for the best outcomes, the best chance at someday being happy. It was also very much like talking to them and just kind of being insulated in these bubbles where like between group chats and constantly retweeting different things that were reblogging different things that were very emotionally charged and very black and white. That's kind of how I say gradually, but it wasn't very gradual. It was like a 2-week time period. And I know this because I went back into my Tumblr archive, like maybe a year or two ago, to see what was the progression of my thoughts. And it kind of started out with me just posting like basic social justice stuff. And within a 2-week time period, I had gone full-blown trans. like just crazy. Um,
And hey, I mean, look, kids
yeah,
of that age are extremely impressionable. I mean, your brain is still
yes.
forming. Your brain is still forming now at 20, almost 22. I mean, the brain at least we're told, doesn't stop maturing until 25 or 26. And, obviously, but at 14 or 15, you're still in a very impressionable phase just in terms of the maturation of your cognitive functions. And so you're more likely to be susceptible to these swift changes that, especially if there's some social incentive there by way of whatever network you're immersed in. So that's why teens are susceptible to peer pressure. That's where that came from, right? So now you have peer pressure existing online. Like, for example, I was a teen in the pre-social media period, but there still were forums. There still were online chats that everybody was in, or at least I was definitely heavily immersed in. And I could imagine myself maybe being somewhat susceptible to a social shift that happened in tandem with my participation in those networks. Maybe not that would have caused me to question my gender identity necessarily, but I don't know, maybe it would have some political impact. In fact, I'm sure it actually did have some political impact on me, because I was friends with people. I was friends with people who I met online, right, through these anonymous chats. Some of them I did end up meeting in real life, or knowing in real life to some extent. Like, it was a lot harder. There was a bigger barrier back then between anonymous online activity and your real life activity. Like, actually, revealing who you were in real life was like a big thing. Now it's like that line has been blurred through technological advances and other factors. But the point is that at that age, I think everybody is going to be much more. It's going to be more susceptible at 14 to these dynamics than you would be at 24 or 34, right? And so to kind of pathologize it in the way that this ideology does seems like it could have some quite ominous implications.
It absolutely does. And I think the concept of peer pressure, like, that's very much there, but I think so much more of what is causing this is the fact that these are young people with mushy, underdeveloped brains, who are in these online communities that are very much forming their entire worlds. Like, I know, at least for me, because I was like super depressed in high school, I didn't have any friends, especially at 14. Like, I went through a period where I just absolutely had no friends, and I was really miserable, and I ended up changing schools the year after, and that was a little bit better. But during that time period when I was first being introduced to this kind of thing, that Tumblr community with that worldview, that intersectional worldview that I thought was normal, that just became my entire world. I kind of saw my real life world, like my family and my school and my community, really, that I didn't participate in, as being completely secondary to my life on Tumblr. And so I think that is another factor, that it's not just peer pressure. Like, it's not just kind of, feeling pressure to fit in like you would maybe in school, so much as just this complete change of perspective that other older generations, I don't think, fully understand.
Right. You're living your social life through these vehicles. I mean, your social life is defined by these vehicles, whereas in past eras, if you were alienated and isolated, you would have to find other, you'd have no social life at all, or you'd have to go out and kind of seek some other in-person form of social life, where now that's not necessary.
Now you can go join this like blossoming active ecosystem of socialization that is just completely dissociated from your real life, and you can just kind of plug in. And it's like, when you're a teenager who's spending every waking hour on this social media platform, like, I would wake up immediately, be on Tumblr, kind of like how I do with Twitter now. But I would just,
I can't hold that against you. I mean, look at me. I'm a mess with this.
But it was a lot worse when I was 14, because I wouldn't pay attention to a single thing that happened in school. Like, I would just be walking down the hallway, Tumblr, in class, Tumblr, coming home in the car, Tumblr, up until 5 a.m., Tumblr, just non-stop. And so, I don't know, I think that has a very profound influence on what you think is normal and what you are willing to do and how you perceptualize different modes of thinking. I don't know how to really describe it.
No, I think that's a perfect way to put it, actually. And I'm just curious, I mean, were there any, depending on how personal or revelatory you want to get here, were there any parental interventions at this point? Did you, quote unquote, disciplinary interventions? I mean, a lot of schools, so at least ostensibly, have policies in place that are supposed to prevent kids from sitting in class and just being on their phones constantly and not paying attention, so they're not learning whatever the subject matter is at hand. I mean, so was that just so trying to trivially easy to circumvent that it wasn't an obstacle at all, or what was that like?
Yeah, so at least at my first school, the school that I ended up leaving for sophomore year of high school, I was very much just kind of like a fly on the wall. I did everything possible to just kind of be ignored, and it succeeded. I just sat in the very back of my class, and I had my like sweatshirt pocket, and I had my phone in my sweatshirt pocket, and I would just be kind of scrolling with my hand like this.
Right. Oh yeah. So that's the move. That's the move when we would want to play games on our calculator. Remember those big what are those calculators called that you're
graphing calculators?
Yeah. And there would be like this black market for like Mario games and Tetris and other things, and you'd go like this, and you'd have it in your pocket, and then you could just play the game all class.
Yep.
That was before there was cool stuff where you could really have on the cell phone. Now it's like a wonder world where you could just like do anything you want on the smartphone, right? But back then, the graphing calculator was where it was at.
At least the graphing calculator didn't tell you were a boy.
Right. The graphing calculator had no ideological prescriptions other than Mario being a fun game. Yeah. So like, what about like, again, depending on how much do you want to describe this, like your parents, other maybe adult authority figures, did they have any influence here? I mean, did they try to get a sense of what was going on with you? What was that dynamic like?
My parents did not really pay that much attention to me.
Okay.
So yeah, I just like was chronically failing every class, and like the teachers would kind of try to be like, hey, yo, like she's not paying attention or doing her homework and seems really depressed. And my parents were just kind of like, she'll get over it. So yeah, they did not really, at some point. Sorry.
Yeah, no. Theoretically, this seems like, because you're obviously an intelligent person, right? So it seems like you would, in theory, be able to succeed in school doing traditional academic activity. So in theory, it sounds like if there had been some kind of disciplinary or authority intervention in your lifestyle, maybe that could have transmuted you into applying your energies to like doing homework and being productive and getting good grades and that kind of thing. Like, it seems like possibly a situation where an intervention of that sort might have had a productive effect if what you do want to produce is having a child prosper in an academic setting. Yeah,
I absolutely agree. And now it's like, I ended up dropping out of college. I went for 1 year, and it just was not working for me. And now I'm just kind of coming to terms with the fact that I don't have these kind of discipline-related skills and like study skills to be able to actually apply my intellect to schoolwork, because I just got so used to doing nothing. Like, I was just constantly, despite the fact that I was not disorderly, my conduct was not disorderly whatsoever. I was always in detention. I was always in trouble for like skipping class to go do whatever, sit on Tumblr, and constantly in trouble for having really bad grades. I barely graduated. So, you would think that my parents would kind of catch on to something, but they I don't know. They're very busy people, I guess.
Yeah. Well, everybody has their own situation to deal with, I guess. Although that's a ridiculous cliche.
For sure.
So obviously, this was sort of this manifested along with depression. You've said, and one thing that I observe among a lot of these younger activists, people who are probably around your age, who are who marinated in the same online social environment, they have a different attitude about mental health, mental illness than even people of my age cohort seem to have had. And I'm not that much older than you, like around 10 years, right? But it seems like a very stark break in terms of how mental illness is viewed, where now it's almost seen as something you want to display, that you want to have pride in to an extent. It's not a private psychological malady that you need to take steps to remedy and get treatment and then move beyond. It's a part of your public expression of identity that people need to accept. And then it also has a political resonance where if you don't accept it, then you're committing some kind of political infraction, right? Or you're denying a core tenet of somebody's identity makeup. And I think that probably has, I mean, and if you're in this, if you're 14 and you spend years and years and years thinking every day about your gender identity and the issues associated with that, then it's going to become a feature just of your overall existence, such that if any aspect of it is, you know, not even questioned, like people don't generally want to be mean to anybody, but if people raise issues or concerns or have apprehension about its political implications, that means that you're being threatened on a personal level.
Yeah.
Yes. Like, what is I don't know, how does mental health, quote, intersect with all this? Because I feel like we still haven't gotten a full handle on what that's like. But just in terms of my observations, a lot of these activists who are, you know, around, you know, in your age cohort, probably would have been in school with you in that age range, right? There's something very much jarringly different here.
Yeah, absolutely. This one's kind of hard, but I do have a lot of thoughts on it. So I think it has to do in part with the fact that a lot of people my age, especially if they were, when they were developing as a teenager, mentally, emotionally, cognitively, especially if they were in these online communities where, like I said, like that kind of swallows your entire perspective of the world. I think that if, you know, their brains are kind of trained in a way to see everything about your identity and your internal experience as a manifestation of these external categories that are just kind of stacked on top of each other. There's no fluidity. There's just kind of like you have your mental illness, which is, you know, a lot of people self-diagnose themselves with mental illnesses. And then you have your gender identity, and then you have your race. I think, you know, that online experience can train you to see things in this very concrete way. And I also think that it can train you to see your internal experience as something that's very external. So I know, at least with the gender thing, it's like you don't like your gender roles that society prescribes to you, and you don't like certain sexed aspects of your body, that leads you to interpret that as a political thing just because of what you're used to seeing. It's so hard to describe, but I think it does have to do with, you know, just being raised in this. And I also think it has to do with how these kind of like mental illness related enclaves of the internet were even before this. So I don't know if you're familiar with like self-harm Tumblr or like pro-Ana Tumblr or any of those things.
I can infer what self-harm Tumblr is. The second term you gave, I'm not as familiar with. Maybe you could define that. I mean, yeah. I remember in 2014, like Tumblr was a big thing, right? It was sweeping the nation. That's an overstatement, but like it was something that if you want to be conscious of trends in sort of like online culture, something that you want to like be somewhat abreast of, right? So I made a Tumblr account and I just scrolled a couple times and like, this is stupid. And I think I looked at it once, and like it's have had a dormant account since 2014, right? It's just not something that appealed to my tendencies, right, at all. So other than just wanting to be at least aware of it, so I could have a sense of what the teens are up to, who are going to be later adults and going to have probably political impacts as they're having now. I just didn't have much involvement in it. But like it seemed like an extension almost to me of LiveJournal culture. Are you familiar? You're familiar with that?
Yeah, I am somewhat familiar. I've never really used LiveJournal, but I've heard other people say the same thing.
Yeah, like LiveJournal seems like it was female dominated, whereas like the stuff that I was like the message boards that I were on were male dominated. It's weird, like the social networks that kids seem to gravitate to seem to be very demarcated by cisgender. I mean, you know, so like the forums that I was on were like putatively video game forums, but like mostly nobody even talked about video games, like here and there, yeah. But those there's just like the organizing impetus for this online community, right? And you just talked about everything. And I think LiveJournal was a little bit was like the female quote unquote equivalent of that at the time, because it was very self-confessional, almost like a diary that you're putting out there. But they didn't have quite as much of a social networking aspect, because that came later with the technological advances, right? But that's sort of what you're describing reminds me of in terms of my own memory of what people of that inclination might have migrated toward at that time. Anyway, yeah. What is the self harm? I don't even remember the other term you used. Something.
Yeah, get ready for a doozy.
Okay, I'm ready.
So on Tumblr, I think Tumblr was started in like 2007, 8, maybe. I don't know, somewhere around there. But before the social justice stuff started really getting popular, which to my knowledge was around like 2011, 2012. I don't know. People might have different experiences with that. I started using it in 2011. And so before
you started using Tumblr in 2011?
Yeah, 2011 or 2012.
Okay, gotcha. Because like 2014, I remember 2014 was when it seemed like it gained enough notoriety and attention that it drew my interest, just like anthropologically, right? So maybe there was somewhere in that period, I guess.
Yeah, but little known to most people, there was already this like major culty extreme social justice stuff going on in like 2011 2012 on Tumblr. And that's why, like I said, it's so weird watching it go mainstream now, because it's like the confused cult of 14-year-old girls that, you know, nobody should be taking seriously or relating to at all is now being echoed by major politicians. And it's just like, oh God, like this is not good.
And major corporations.
It's not good.
By the way, people, Angela Nagel, you're familiar with, who I co-wrote the article with, friend of mine. She, in her book Kill All Normies in 2017, had a big section on Tumblr culture. This was something that she was ahead of the curve on in terms of detecting its political influence.
Yeah.
Right. And then also by extension, the backlash, quote unquote, that it can create amongst the supposed alt-right, and how you have just these online culture wars raging, which eventually spill out into normie culture. And I think that's really what we're seeing now as a culmination of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you read that book, by the way?
I have not. What did you say it was called? Kill All Normies?
Kill All Normies, yeah, Angela Nagel. It's worth
I got to read that. Yeah, I will. But yeah, so before the social justice stuff really became popular, there was a kind of community centered around interpretation of one's inner distress and inner experience that was very heavily centered around self-harm and depression. And it was people posting thousands and thousands and thousands of graphic pictures, videos, and GIFs of self-harm and suicidal imagery. And there was people
like
who literally
cutting and things like that, like on the arms and such. Yeah.
Very, very graphic, very graphic. And there was people who literally had blogs that they would use 12 hours a day, completely devoted to just scrolling through and reblogging these videos of people cutting themselves and, gifs of people hanging themselves, or gifs of quotes from movies that were, I guess they felt they related to, that were very, very depressive. And then the other one that I mentioned was pro-ana. That stands for pro-anorexia. And this is pretty well documented in the literature around anorexia, that these communities are very instrumental in young girls' adoption of the disease, that a lot of psychologists think that without these communities to spread the mindset of anorexia in a socially contagious way, that a lot of young girls would not actually develop anorexia. So I think that those communities and how people would scroll for 12 hours a day looking at self-harm and anorexia content, and making that a huge part of their identity, a huge part of what they were thinking about on a daily basis, and kind of merging their identity and how they perceive themselves, how they perceive their bodies, with this detached online constant stream of content with their identity as a whole. And so I think that when the social justice ideology was introduced on top of that, the two kind of merged, and that's where you get the extreme identification with mental illness, but also the viewing of said mental illness in the hierarchy of intersectional social justice. I think that's where it comes from at its core. And now it's just kind of being mainstreamed, and actual psychological organizations and psychologists, practicing psychologists, are adopting these views. And it's not good. It's very dangerous, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about an epidemic. The epidemic seems to me just around how mental health is being portrayed and treated right now. I mean, I don't think, I think, there was a movement or a move a couple of years ago. I remember in also in 2014, maybe coincidentally, maybe not. I remember in my hometown in New Jersey, in the area, there were street signs going up, like street signs that looked like, do not enter, or an ordinary street sign that said X community is a stigma-free town. And the reduction of stigma around mental illness, and having that be something that was promulgated by people in positions of authority and power, say like municipal officials who were in charge of putting up street signs, that seemed to me like a positive thing, right? Because it's true that in the past there was a heavy stigma around issues of mental illness that maybe prevented people from seeking treatment or being honest with themselves, or maybe their intimate partners or whomever, about what they were suffering through. And so you did want to reduce the stigma around that to at least some extent, but now it seems like it's moved beyond just stigma reduction to like an embrace, or to a valorization, or a legitimization of mental illness just as an ideal state. And that seems frightening to me. Like, you should want like mental illness is something that you should recognize as an issue in yourself that could be transcended, right? That could be moved beyond. And now it's like it's something that's just to be accepted, and to be folded into all these other expressions of life, such as politics, right? And so like people whose activism now, it seems like it's entirely predicated on their divergent mental state. And again, not that these people should be condemned, or that they should be abused or harassed or whatever, but it seems like the entire framework for processing this has been fundamentally warped, and within a shockingly short period of time. Like, this was not the standard when I was like, in college, right? It was just a different mode of understanding this.
I think part of the problem is honestly the Western psychiatric model of diagnosis of mental illness. And I use that in quotations because I used to very much be one of these people who saw my mental illness as part of my identity. I self-diagnosed with 10 different things. I was kind of one of these activist type people, at least in that way. And as I have grown and attended therapy, I've switched to seeing my experience less as a mental illness that I have and more as this complicated emotional set of emotional reactions that I've had to different stimuli. And that's been a lot more helpful to me than just viewing myself as someone who has a disorder, or multiple disorders, as I once thought. So I think part of the problem is that people, a lot of times when they seek help and they go through the mainstream routes, you just get a label slapped on you and you get a prescription and you get sent on your way. And it kind of gives you this way of perceiving your emotional distress, again, in this very concrete, blocky way, as opposed to, like I said, this fluid, complicated, emotional turmoil that a lot of people, like, life is suffering. Everyone's going to have some kind of emotional turmoil. And the fact that instead of, people being helped to understand truly on a deep level what they're going through, they're given a label and a prescription a lot of the times, not every time, but a lot of the times. I think that, and the popularization of that way of treating mental illness has really contributed to people adopting that as an identity, because what else are you supposed to do when you feel hopeless and you're in pain and you go and seek help? And instead of getting someone who compassionately brings you in and helps you to understand what you're going through, a lot of people, especially if they're low income and they're going through like a lot of these kind of clinics where it's a lot of grad students just slapping labels on people. I think that's where you get people overly identifying with their diagnosis. And then when they hear someone tell them like, oh, you shouldn't really identify with that, you should move on. It's like they think, how the hell am I supposed to move on? There's no moving on. I have this disorder. You don't understand what it's like to be me. I have this disorder. Stop telling me I should just get over it. They get very offended because they've had this merging of their identity and they've had this merging of their internal emotional experience with that label. And it's very hard to undo that.
Because you're not giving them other opportunities to achieve emotional gratification or fulfillment or a sense of purpose. So that sense of purpose can be filtered through this attachment to whatever disorder was slapped on them, probably at an early age, or maybe not, but whatever age that they were assigned that diagnosis, it then becomes so intrinsic to their self-conception that they almost can't, or they don't have the ability to find gratification or stimulation through some other more productive channel, right? So having an intellectual pursuit, having a professional pursuit, having a social pursuit, whatever it may be, even manual labor, for Christ's sake. I mean, who knows what it could be. And I think that's really, there's something that's very deep about society that says. Maybe it might have some relationship to just the secularization of society, where you have less people having like a firm religiosity. I'm not religious, meaning I've been an atheist since I began thinking about the issues as a teenager, and I still am. But you can be an atheist and recognize that people have like a spiritual quote unquote impulse that they need to get satisfied over the course of life. And in fact, you see a lot of that now with this protest movement. I mean, I've written about this. I don't know if you've seen any of the articles that I've done, but you have extremely obvious expressions of the religious impulse at many of these protests, where people have their hands in the sky like it's an evangelical worship ceremony. You have say their name is like chanting a pantheon of martyr type figures, rituals and public confessions and et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on, and it just strikes me, or has struck me, as an expression of something that is kind of like just fine-tuned into the human condition, right? Where you need an outlet for that, whether it is Christianity or Islam or this kind of quasi-secular religion now around Black Lives Matter and anti-racism, or even in the gender arena. You need something. And and also, as you were speaking, I thought back to what might be a precursor to some of this kind of heavily medicalized approach to disorder that causes people to attach to it maybe excessively or in a way that is detrimental to their flourishment, which is ADHD, right? I mean,
yeah.
but that really, I think, came into full being maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s. You had kids, mostly boys, but not exclusively, who couldn't sit still at school as like a 9-year-old boy, right? And who like maybe weren't that interested in being taught multiplication tables.
Yeah.
End up getting diagnosed with a disorder and being put on relatively powerful drugs, stimulants,
Yep.
Adderall and such. I don't know if you ever
that are neurotoxic.
Right. I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried Adderall. I have.
I have, yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, it's not, it's not going to warp your entire experience necessarily, but it's a powerful drug. I mean, you can detect the effects. It's a stimulant.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have like people saying, I even see now adults saying, I have ADHD. They make that like kind of central to their identity. And it just seems like, I don't know, have we really thought hard about whether ADHD really is a recognizable disorder in the way that you might want to suggest, or are you just using that to kind of give your identity cohesion? I mean, there was a book that I read again in 2014. I keep coming back to that year for whatever reason. Maybe it was like a turning point that we weren't familiar with at the time. I'm trying to remember the name of the book. Maybe I should take more Adderall to remember. It's like ADHD is not real, not a disorder, but it was written by a doctor who treated many ADHD patients. And here we go. ADHD Does Not Exist by Richard Saul. Okay, so if people are
I've seen that book,
yeah. Okay, yeah. And it was like how in his clinical experience, ADHD was not a disorder unto itself. It was people having issues with children having issues with depression or issues with some kind of neurochemical disorder, whether it was eating habits, sleeping habits. The point is that he said that all these disparate symptoms had been conglomerated under the rubric of ADHD speciously, and then been used as a justification for putting children on drugs. And I feel like that maybe was a precursor in terms of the way that the psychological establishment, medical establishment, et cetera, has taken at face value a lot of the complaints and grievances that people within this gender identity cohort proffer, so that it's now kind of established as a recognizable disorder, just like ADHD or just like anything else. So maybe that was sort of like a precedent that is relevant here. But I'm just kind of sort of thinking aloud as I was listening to you.
No, yeah, I totally agree. And I think this modality of treating, I hate the clinical terminology, because it's like when you actually think about it, someone's emotional experience is not the same as a physical illness. Like there's so much that goes into emotions and how you feel. It just can't be compared to a physical illness. You can't compare, like, I don't know, some kind of, genetic disorder to someone who has a low mood, because there are so many different things that can be causing that. And same with ADHD. I'm diagnosed with ADHD, and I took Vyvanse for months. And I stopped because I read about the potential, long-term risks of using it, and that scared the shit out of me. And I also started learning about, a lot of the things that can result in the symptoms that I was experiencing. Like you said, there's depression, but there's also trauma. PTSD, especially childhood PTSD, and the effects of that have a profound impact on your cognitive function. And that's why people have the symptoms, and that's why a lot of the times talk therapy doesn't work for people with complex childhood trauma issues. And it can cause these kinds of neurological symptoms. So can, like you said, bad eating habits. People really underestimate that. They don't understand how diet and exercise impact your mood and your cognitive function. And then on top of that, there's addiction. I think social media addiction that we're all raised with since the age of like 10 or 11 nowadays can have a profound impact on your cognitive function and your ability to sustain attention, your ability to motivate. Like there's so many things that go into it, but if I go to a doctor and tell them about my symptoms, or if I go to a psychologist, a mainstream psychologist, they're probably just going to prescribe me stimulants. And I think that's a big problem. And I think the fact that that is the mainstream way of dealing with people's mental and emotional complaints and struggles, I think that has set up the perfect breeding ground for what we see now with this gender stuff, because you go in to a psychologist like this treatment of gender dysphoria through medicalization has completely engulfed psychology. Like if you go to a psychologist nowadays, most likely, and you say that you have gender dysphoria and you express what you're feeling about your body and your sex characteristics and your gender roles, most likely they're going to diagnose you with gender dysphoria and put you on the track to medicalization. And I think that that has its roots in this like deeply sick and confused Western idea that we have about emotions, that they're a disease that needs to be fixed.
Right. You know, this culture around mindfulness and meditation can have some kind of comical side effects. And you have like a lot of like Silicon Valley types who adhere to it as some kind of weird religion, but it does have its real benefits. Like, I mean, I've done a meditation retreat, 10-day silent retreat in the past, and I didn't keep up with it on the regimen that is advised, right? So like you're supposed to do it in the morning and at night, and then do additional retreats. But it does impart some lessons that you can carry forward, and this is obviously derived from a more Eastern tradition, and like even like following Eastern medicine or Eastern psychology can become a little bit of a cult unto itself. But I mean, obviously, it's going to have some wisdom there from over the course of millennia. But if you could just note an emotion, right, and if you have a little bit more of a mindful awareness of the emotions that are engulfing you, say, at a given time, then I think that makes it easier for you to detach from it, because it's supposed to diminish your sense of self, right? The self is not real is like the basic mantra. I mean, that's the Buddha's message, right? But it is helpful, because I think it's almost like the inverse of a lot of this stuff. Like if I just note that I have this emotion impinging upon me, then and I have a sort of a framework where I can resist the impulse to wholly associate myself as an identity with that emotion, then I can transcend it, and I can more healthily process it. And it seems like that's missing. So like, while I agree that like a lot of these women in yoga pants who say they're mindful and stuff can be a little bit humorous, there are some really profound lessons to be learned there that run really counter to a lot of these trends that we've discussed. I don't know. Have you looked into that at all?
Yeah, I have. I'm trying to. This COVID situation blew up my plans, but I have a friend who's really into Vedic meditation. I don't know what kind of meditation you were doing, but
it's
Vedic
called
meditation.
It's called Vipassana.
That's different.
Yeah.
But yeah, Vedic meditation or transcendental meditation is the type of meditation that has the most clinical research behind it. And it's actually like the research is so amazing, especially for like PTSD. It actually, like the whole point is that you say a mantra, and as you say a mantra, your thoughts quiet down up until the point after some practice, you have just like complete silence in your mind. And that initiates processes neurologically that resemble, is it REM sleep or is it stage 4? I'm not sure. But it actually has these healing properties on your brain, and it has shown really, 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 really good results clinically for all sorts of mental issues. So I have looked into it, but COVID blew up my plans because you actually have to go be taught how to do it. You can't just like look
Yeah,
it
I mean,
up
you have
online.
to, at least when I did it, you have to like sit in a big auditorium with like a bunch of other people without social distancing, right? So I don't know what. I'm still on their email list, and I just got an email recently about their plan to reopen or whatever. It's actually free. I mean, it's part of the belief system is that it must be free, and you could just go for this 10-day retreat with food and everything, lodging. Maybe something to look into if you're interested. But before, as we reach our endpoint here, just describe a little bit what led to the detransitioning decision.
Yeah.
What had you taken? What tangible steps had you taken to transition, and then what led to the detransitioning?
Yeah. So when I was 18, like 1 or 2 weeks after my 18th birthday, I made an appointment with Planned Parenthood. They do informed consent, which we don't have enough time for that. But so I went over there. They asked me like 10 questions. I have copies of, my entire file that includes the questions that they asked me. They asked me like 10 questions. I gave some basic cookie cutter answers, and they okayed me for testosterone. And that same appointment, I got my first injection.
Wait. Hold on. Sorry. Maybe I was not aware that Planned Parenthood provides these services. Is that something I should have been aware of? Like,
yeah, every Planned Parenthood.
Is it common to go to Planned Parenthood to get transition consultations? I honestly was not aware of that being the case.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure at this point, back in 2016 when I did this, it was like most Planned Parenthoods, but not every. But now I'm pretty sure every single Planned Parenthood has informed consent HRT, which basically means they give you a packet, you sign it saying that they're not liable for if you get fucked up, and then you get your shot. You get your testosterone or your
within one meeting or consultation.
I was in and out in an hour.
So let me just make sure I have this 100% clear.
Mm-hmm.
So you schedule an appointment at Planned Parenthood.
Mm-hmm.
You go in, you fill out sort of this perfunctory questionnaire, and at the end, within that 1 hour meeting, you are then being injected with hormones.
Yes, and I have my medical records where I can show you one appointment. They didn't run any blood tests for like what my hormone levels were like already. They didn't do anything. There are other people that I've talked to who say they did get blood tests and they did have to wait a week for the blood test to get back so they can get their prescription. But I also know people with stories like mine who like literally you just go in there, the lady talks to you, she's like, sounds good, and then they inject you with testosterone. And that's what happened to me. And so I was on testosterone for about 17 months. And over the course of those 17 months, for the first
so sorry, but was just so I'm clear on the chronology here. So then after the initial meeting, when you're injected, you then get a prescription that you can go fill, and then you can take it daily or weekly, however long.
They gave me the prescription, and then they said, go to the CVS across the street. I went to the CVS across the street. I came back, and they showed me how to do my shot.
Oh, okay. So you actually had to go obtain the prescription yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then the only follow-up I got was 2 weeks after the fact. The lady called me and she asked like, how's it going? And I said, fine, I'm not showing any problems or anything. And she said, okay, good. Make an appointment somewhere in 6 months. And I said, okay. And so, like I said, I was on testosterone for 17 months, and for the first 6 months, I was kind of having what's known as like the honeymoon period, where I was like, this is awesome, this is so cool, oh my God. It was very intense. Another fun fact about the medical competency of these people is that they gave me the max possible dose that you can give, because I said that I think I have higher estrogen because my hips are big. And they said, seems legit. So they gave me
Is there a correlation between estrogen and hips? I mean, I'm not familiar with that.
I don't know. I don't know. That's just what my brain was telling me, that like, oh, I have big hips, which I don't even. I just have like body image issues. And I was like, I think I have a lot of estrogen. And they were like, yeah, that seems legit. We'll just give you the highest dose. And again, I have the papers to show you. I was on 100 milligrams a week of testosterone. And that's a lot. Usually you're supposed to start at 25 and work your way up to 50, maybe 75, and in the most extremes, 100. But I was on that from the get-go. And that did a fucking number on me psychologically and physically. But for the first 6 months, it seemed good. It was kind of like, I had a lot of energy. I was just kind of like vivacious, I guess. Like it's almost like a drug. And then after that period, that's when like the mental health issues that were already there that I was trying to transition to get away from, they started really coming back. And at this point I was in school and I started like failing my classes again. I started feeling really low about myself. I started smoking a lot of weed and drinking alcohol. And my mental health and my functioning as a person just like deteriorated very quickly to the point where I was much worse off mentally than I ever was in high school. So when I was trying.
So during this quote unquote honeymoon period, where you were feeling vivacious and had a lot of energy, just describe what that honeymoon period is like a little more, because it seems like it almost functions like an antidepressant, right? Because like one feature of depression is you have a lack of energy, that you feel unsociable, right? That you feel just lie in bed all day or something, right? So is that kind of the effect that it had?
A little bit, but it was kind of more complicated. So I kind of had this general sense of like, I'm a confident man now. And I just kind of like went around like me, a confident man. And so I like kind of just walked around. I had this like chip on my shoulder.
There is just some inherent comedy in a lot of this that so if I excuse the laughter.
Don't worry about it. I laugh about it myself.
Okay.
Because it's like, girl, you were crazy. But yeah, so I had this like chip on my shoulder. Your sex drive goes through the fucking roof. And I was like a virgin before this, and now I was having a lot of sex, and I just felt really good about myself.
So you were driven to have sex with men, right? Or not?
No.
With women. Okay.
Well, my partner at the time was a trans man. So in my head, I was like, this is a man, but not really. That's a whole other thing.
Wait, so
yeah.
Sorry, but like, was the sexual attraction, the sexual drive you had at the time, was it wasn't defined by attraction to male or female? It was just a generalized sexual attraction to like anybody in like a non-binary sense?
Yeah, it was just kind of like, I will fuck anything that moves. Because before this, I had a really low libido, and I wasn't really interested in sex. And then within a week of being on testosterone, it was like this feeling that I did not understand, which just like took over my body. And it's like anything remotely sexual.
now you know why 15-year-old boys like have an orgasm if they see a bra strap.
For real.
Yeah.
For real. Like, this made me empathize with teenage boys so much. They're like, why are men so disgusting? And then I experienced it. Yeah. But yeah, so I had this kind of energy, but it also made me really irritable. I was really angry all the time. I kind of felt like breaking shit all the time. And I could feel that, there was a lot of this like chaotic energy in my brain and in my body. And then, so the mental health got really, 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 really bad. And I ended up being hospitalized twice because apparently, if you have mental health issues, testosterone, especially in the high dose that I was given, can just really destabilize you. And so I started experiencing a lot of symptoms that I had never experienced, and I haven't experienced since I've been off of testosterone. I started experiencing like intense paranoia, these like dissociative episodes where I would just get so panicked and like just like run outside and like just be confused. And intense depression where I like literally couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't hold down a job. Just like really, really bad. I dropped out of college. So that happened. And then that was when I kind of started realizing like this is not what I thought it was going to be. Like in my head in high school, I thought that I was going to transform into like this sexy Tumblr boy and just like, you know, be in college, like walking to class, looking cute. And that didn't happen at all. I just kind of became, you know, this like weird, slightly masculine looking girl thing with intense psychological issues. And that's what kind of led me to be like, this is not what I ordered. Can I speak to a manager? And yeah, I tried to reject that.
So at this time, when you say like you were male, vaguely male looking, you didn't modify your body, right? You were just you were just taking, other than taking the hormone.
Yeah,
is that right?
I never got surgery. I really, really desperately wanted it, but I felt too depressed to really like pursue it. I had no motivation whatsoever. And the thing with testosterone, so despite the fact that I was on a really, really large dose, what that does in your body is if you are taking, as a female, if you're taking too much testosterone for your body will start producing excess estrogen to kind of like counterbalance it. And so like, I don't have a doctor to tell me that this is the case, but what I believe, like the reason I don't have a really deep voice, the reason I, you know, kind of got out of it, still being able to, especially 2 years later, like look like I never was on testosterone, is because I did have that really high dose that while I was on it, it really messed me up. But now like 2 years later, I think it kind of saved me from having more irreversible changes than I do.
So your voice didn't really deepen?
It did. Like this is deeper than how I used to talk in high school, but it's not as deep as some other women.
But people's voices deepen with age anyway. So I don't know. Do you think it deepened more than it might have otherwise, or?
I think it would have deepened more had I been on a lower dose.
Okay.
But yeah, it is deeper. But the thing that is more like affected my voice than just the pitch of it when I talk is that I can't make high pitched noises and I can't shriek anymore. So like, you know how women like shriek, like I just can't do that. It doesn't like.
Maybe that's not such a bad thing actually.
Except I always worry that like, what if I'm getting like in an alley and I'm just like.
Yeah. Or like if a mouse runs into the room or something.
Yeah, no, that literally happens when I see a bug. I'm just like. So that happened, and I can't really sing anymore. I used to enjoy singing, but I just like my voice above a certain pitch, it just cuts off. But I can go really, really low, which I didn't used to be able to do. So those are the effects on my voice.
You can do like a Johnny Cash song.
Yes. Like pretty accurately. It's kind of scary.
I fell into a burning ring of fire. Oh, anyway, sorry for the musical interlude, people. So then like, was there a moment that clicked where you said, okay, I'm going to now cease taking hormones?
Yeah.
Or like what happened exactly?
Yeah. So my ex at the time, she made me a video for like Valentine's Day or something. That was a compilation of like pictures of us since we first started dating. And we started dating maybe a week after I started testosterone. And it was like a chronological series of photos. So it was kind of like, even though it was like our relationship, it was also at the same time a chronological series of photos of my transformation on testosterone. And as I watched this video, all of these doubts that I had been repressing for months just kind of like exploded out of me. And I was like, oh my God, what the fuck did I do to myself? And it just kind of like dawned on me finally. And I just started sobbing and I was like hyperventilating and just freaking the fuck out and just wishing with all of my might that I could turn back time and stop myself from doing this. I thought my life was over. I thought I would never look good again. I thought like, what the fuck did I do? I'm going to have to tell my parents now. They're going to laugh in my face. Everyone's going to laugh at me. And then, you know, I stopped my testosterone. I never did a shot again.
So is stopping taking the testosterone in your context tantamount to detransitioning? Like, does that mean you've detransitioned when you just no longer take the testosterone? Or
For me, it was,
are there other steps involved in that?
yeah, for me, it was like I made a concerted effort to appear male. So like naturally, I don't know, probably like medium feminine. I'm not like super, super feminine. I just, I wear a cute frilly shirt or whatever.
Your shirt looks fine to me. Yeah, it looks,
but like during this time, I was trying really hard to look like a guy. So I had like buzz cut. I would wear like men's clothes, even though they didn't fit me very well. But I tried very hard to look male.
Were you going by what was your pronoun at this time?
He.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was just like regular old trans guy at this point. And yeah, so detransitioning for me meant stopping testosterone, but it also meant like a complete rework of my appearance and how I presented myself, which is really awkward. I wore a wig for a couple months until my hair kind of grew out a little bit to at least like where I could just pin it back and make it look a little bit cute. And yeah, I started wearing a little bit of makeup, not too much. And I stopped trying to make my mannerisms look super male, because when I was identifying as trans, I would be like, yo, what's up? Like just really trying to look male.
Would you like man spread if you're like sitting in public transportation? I don't know if you took public transportation, but like where you're just like asserting your dominance by like spreading your legs apart. Okay.
Especially because I'm 5'3" and 3/4, but I'm really short, so it wasn't like clear that I was male right off the bat. I had to do a lot of work to be consistently seen as male. So yeah, I would do all sorts of cringe bullshit like that. Yeah, so detransitioning meant like a complete rework, and it also meant coming out. Like I made a Facebook post being like, so.
So ...
And like the part with my family was the worst, because when I started testosterone, I got into a huge fight with my mom, and we basically didn't talk for like a year. And we slowly started talking again like a year into it. But yeah, just like the damage that it did to our already kind of crippled relationship with both my mom and my dad. Yeah, it was pretty humiliating for me, and I was very, very anxious about it. Fortunately, now our relationship is better, and it wasn't that big of a deal. When I told them, they were just like, okay, fine. They didn't rub it in my face or anything. But yeah, that's kind of what it looked like for me.
Right. So it's like a double coming out process. And then, I mean, I'm sure people ask you, okay, so then what was the problem in terms of why you did that in the first place? Or like, don't you feel stupid? And I'm not sure that they confronted you by calling you stupid, but like you could imagine people thinking to themselves, okay, maybe then she was like delusional or something in terms of why she did this, right? So like that's another burden that you have to then bear, I guess, in terms of the questions you receive as to why you would then detransition, right?
I think most people who were watching me at the time, who knew that I identified as trans before I came out, and like as I was transitioning, they knew that it was just a manifestation of like the difficult things that I was going through, and it was like a coping mechanism. I think most people could probably see that. They could just see that I was, wanting to fit in, wanting an answer, wanting a way out. So to my knowledge, nobody thinks that I was like super crazy. They just think that, I was doing the best I could. Like I was just coping.
Yeah. So like, what are you doing? Is your involvement in this organization now to do what? Spread awareness, do advocacy? Like, what are you trying to forge here exactly that draws on your experience?
Yeah, so with Peak Resilience, we've at this point disbanded and are kind of like doing our own things. But the original intent was just like to put that experience out there, because at least when I detransitioned, there was no content out there. There was like maybe 1 or 2 blogs or articles, but I just didn't really relate to their experience because they were from like a different generation of detransition people. And I think the experiences are a little bit different between someone who goes on Tumblr and gets their brain warped versus someone who doesn't have that experience. So Yeah, the goal was to just put that out there because we kind of figured that more people were going to end up detransitioning because, you know, we saw our experience and then we looked back on all the young women that we knew that were following similar trajectories, and it was just like only a matter of time. So we did put out some of that content, and our expectations came to fruition. Now there's hundreds of detransitioned women on Twitter. There's over 10,000 members of the detrans subreddit. It's just like it's exploded in terms of
Has that been banned? Was that banned yesterday, or is that still around?
That one is still around.
Okay.
It was just the gender critical one. I really hope they don't ban it because that subreddit is honestly life-saving. When I first joined it, there was only like 100 members. But even for me, just seeing like the few people on there, it really reassured me and made me feel like, you know, like there's, like I'm not alone and I didn't completely fuck up my life. Like there's other people out there who have been through the same thing. Yeah. So I really hope it doesn't get banned.
Have you encountered pushback, let's say, from people who are more in the standard frame of trans issues? Because some of them are known to be somewhat aggressive, you know, in terms of advocating their position and trying to and criticizing those who depart from that position, to put it in the most charitable possible way.
Yeah. So there are a few notable individuals who really like to like retweet things that I say and, you know, talk shit or whatever. There's like a few notable trans activists with large followings who do that. And it's always so annoying when they do that because then all their followers descend upon me and they're just like these little... whatever.
You don't have to complete that sentence.
Yeah, I don't want to, you know, get too. Yeah. And then there's also just like the general trans community. I think for the most part, the people who interact with detransition content and are still trans are what's known as trans medicalist. So they're usually relatively young female to male trans people who view being trans as a neurological condition, that they have a male brain in a female body, even though there's no scientific consent, there's no scientific basis for that whatsoever, but they believe that very firmly. And they are of the opinion that detransition people they just wanted attention when they were trans. They never truly experienced gender dysphoria because if they had actually experienced it, they would still be trans. And they have a very hostile attitude on average, like not everyone obviously, but a lot of these people have a really hostile attitude because they see people like us as people who are hogging resources and making a bad name for trans people because we make them look delegitimized. So that's a lot of the pushback that I've gotten personally and that Peak Resilience Project has gotten. There have been a couple popular trans medicalist personalities who have kind of made it a mission to discredit us and just like slander us and say that we were just crazy attention seekers. But honestly, nothing that bad. For me personally, I know other people have been through worse, and usually the people who get it worse are the like radical feminists. They will actually get people protesting them and stuff, but with us, with us, it's mostly just trying to brush us under the rug and discredit us as just crazy people. Like, don't listen to us. We're just crazy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that's a positive step for you then, that the resistance, so to say, is not quite as intrusive or debilitating than maybe it would have been a few years ago or something. So maybe there's somewhat of a turn there, at least in an initial phase. Mm-hmm. You know, I know J.K. Rowling probably has a different perspective on this. She's constantly in an uproar over her perspective on trans stuff. We don't have to get into that. I mean, who cares about Harry Potter? So just the final thing, we sort of touched on this at the very beginning, but like, how has this informed the way that you've perceived the protest movement, right? Because like I've been to a number of protests, including in Chicago. You know, in Chicago, they just had they canceled an ordinary Pride march, but then like a splinter march emerged anyway because they put it under the banner of Black Trans Lives Matter, right? And so many of the marches that I've been to, even those that don't have Black trans as the impetus, seem to almost inevitably kind of evolve into a Black trans lives thing, right? So you have the people waving the signs, doing the chants, etc. So it's obviously a very prominent feature of this protest movement. And yeah, I believe that the people who started like Black Lives Matter in terms of the actual organization, rather than just the chant or the slogan, a lot of them are queer women who have made gender non-binary issues kind of like a central to the kind of organizing motivation for what they're doing. Yeah. So how has this sort of prism informed the way that you've interpreted a lot of this protest stuff? I mean, are you kind of like looking out for manifestations of trans stuff within the racial justice paradigm, or what are you looking for?
Like I said earlier, I don't really look for it because I expect it. Like, to me, that's just, even though I'm outside of this ideology now at this point, like over the past 2 years, I've had a massive upheaval of how I see the world. And I very much see this movement as a destructive ideology. And so I know just from personal experience of having previously believed this way, and yes, in a very religious sense, I mean believed. I just kind of expect it, because wherever there is this intersectional stuff, at some point they're going to prioritize the most oppressed of the hierarchy, and that just tends to be Black trans women, lesbian sex workers. So it just kind of seems normal to me, and it's just kind of unfortunate that it's so mainstream that we can have this like Black trans women stuff marching through the streets and people see it. I mean, I don't know how many people actually see it as a good thing. I'm sure a lot of people are just keeping quiet.
And by the way, most people marching and chanting Black trans lives matter are white. Okay, so it's not. I mean, so it's not. This is not a racial reductionist thing. It's like mostly, largely, but not exclusively, but largely white activist-minded people in their teens, 20s, maybe 30s, adopting this as their moral cover or their moral justification for what it is that they're doing, because they can fold it into the anti-racism framework, which is now so dominant.
Because they truly see the world and society, they see the human race as being broken up into these little blocks that are on top of each other and under each other of this hierarchy of privilege and oppression. And there's a saying amongst them that no one is free until Black trans women are free. So if you are a white person in this movement, in this ideology, you are sacked with tons of white guilt, and you have an entire complex that cripples you around the fact that you're white, or God forbid cisgender. You are going to make it a priority to use your voice to free Black trans women.
Well, they say what white guilt. I mean, I don't use the term white guilt because that's like a lot of right wingers will say, well, you invoke the term white guilt to discredit like any awareness of racial disparities. But
no.
I know you're not doing that. But I'm saying that at the white silence equals violence is one of the big slogans here. So if you're silent, you're violent, right? So they're quote using their voice to elevate what they regard as the most oppressed class, which is the Black trans women or whatever. And then that again provides them with the moral justification that they need to advance the entirety of the ideology, as inchoate as it may be, in terms of these protests, in terms of their social media activism, in terms of whether the other political involvement that they may have. It's just the perfect. It's the perfect framing for them to just pursue whatever their pre-existing ideological goals were.
Yeah. And I use the term white guilt because I do think it describes what I went through. Okay. I do believe I had a lot of guilt about my race because of this ideology, especially from a young age. Like, that's kind of before I became a true believer, I had this crippling guilt. That was the first thing that was instilled in me when I started using Tumblr and getting involved in this ideology. The first thing was being made to feel guilty for my race and my previous complicity in these oppressive structures by being a white person and not being awoken yet to my role in both upholding white supremacy and ending white supremacy. So before I had any more complex views on any of that, I was guilty. And that guilt lasted up until actually very, very recently. It's only in the last maybe like 6 months that I have started to view my race as a neutral thing, that like, I'm just white, like I didn't do anything. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other discussion. I just read the Robin DiAngelo book, White Fragility, and
Yeah.
God, it's very depressing in terms of how that's going to be internalized across so many sectors of elite society, and not just elite society, because girls on Tumblr probably are internalizing it as well. I don't know. Do they still use Tumblr to the same extent, or like has it transitioned elsewhere? Sorry to use that word, but like has the Tumblr activity gone elsewhere? Like, what's the status of it now? Do you check in on it at all?
I think a lot of people have moved to Twitter.
Well, that's. So they're treading on my water then. Like I gotta take charge of the situation. Twitter's like the only social network that I really use.
Me too. I don't really use anything else.
Unless you consider YouTube a social network, which I guess kind of it is, but.
But yeah, most of them have moved to Twitter, but I don't think Tumblr is really the same because now it's like loaded with ads. There's all this content moderation, and it's just kind of not the same anymore. So I think there's definitely still people on there who use it, but it's not how it used to be.
Yeah. Okay, so I know you have to go. So people should. Do you want people to follow you? How can people keep tabs on what you're up to, etc.?
Yeah, go ahead and follow me.
Okay, I will. I'll add your. Give your Twitter handle.
My Twitter is LaCroix, but spelled with like a Polish twinge because I'm Polish. So it's LACROICZ. Yeah, I don't even know how to spell my own at. But he'll put it in the description.
Yeah, I'll put it in the description box. Are you planning on writing or doing other media type things, or what? Do you have any kind of general plan, or what do you think?
I do a little bit of writing here and there, but yeah, I really would like to do some more writing. I'm really looking into starting school soon, so that will probably take up my time a lot. But yeah, if I do writing, I post it on Twitter, so that's how you will know if I do writing.
All right, people. Thanks for hanging in for an hour and 27 plus minutes, and thank you, Helena, for this very enlightening discussion. I think you are, like we mentioned over the course of the conversation, older people might not have an intuitive grasp of a lot of these dynamics, so you need somebody of your age, really, just to be able to intelligently synthesize it. And I think you've definitely done that, at least in this conversation. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. And can I just say that you are the first left wing, well, maybe not the first, but you are one of the only left wing people in journalism to interact with this topic. Because out of every journalist or person that approaches me to hear my story, it's almost always religious conservative people. And not that I have that much of a problem with it, but I just think it's very awesome and very appreciated that you are not afraid of the social justice onslaught that you might get.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, it's weird for me because this was never a major issue for me, right? But it just seems like it's come to the fore now where you're almost forced to engage with it. And so, I'll try to do so with a little bit of critical scrutiny. And also, whether you regard me as left wing is an open topic of debate online as well. I mean, a lot of people dispute that, but I generally, roughly speaking, have been on the left for my whole life. And also, Jesse Singal has done work on this. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
He's a good one.
Yeah, and Katie Herzog, who he now has a podcast with, but it's just them two, pretty much. And the thing is, I don't want to be a guy who's really involved in trans stuff constantly. It's just like a thing that's
Yeah.
now on the agenda that you have to. I think it's worth intelligently discussing, at least in terms of how it quote intersects with some of the big activism and political issues now that have been at the forefront. So that's sort of my general philosophy. But I appreciate the compliment.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, so maybe we'll talk again sometime in the future. And thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.